We're going to talk about all things fraud within the Alzheimer's space, which is obviously it's a topic my listeners know I'm incredibly passionate about. I had a loved one. My mom had dementia for many years, and I think this represents, so many years of lost, misplaced hope, misspent dollars, and it's a real tragedy. So hopefully we can go down that rabbit hole and spill the tea on all things Alzheimer's fraud, and then leave my audience maybe on a hopeful note, if that's cool with you.
I think we can do that. And thank you so much for having me here, Max. I know that this is something that's very close to you, and the whole journey that you went through with your mom. It's close to me too. My dad also had dementia, and it's a process that we all have to examine carefully and try to do the best we can.
Amen. Yeah. So I guess before we get into the specifics, how did you maybe walk us through the discovery process for you? Like, how did you stumble upon, because you've exposed at this point via Science magazine, many instances of fraud within the field of Alzheimer's disease. So maybe give us like the backstory before we get into the specifics.
Sure. So I'm an investigative reporter. I've been doing this for a very long time. And I obviously, as a reporter for Science magazine, I focus on science and medical topics. And over the years, I've gotten a lot of people coming to me with tips about problems they're experiencing or ideas that they have, or even sometimes whistleblower tips of problems they see in their own environment but don't know what to do about and need help. And this story was the result of a tip like that, which actually came via a close colleague of mine at Science who passed it along to me. And it involved a case of a Alzheimer's drug called Simufilum, which is produced by a company called Cassava Sciences. Now that's a long and strange, and I'm sorry to say, kind of a sordid tale. That drug is out of the picture now. It pretty much crashed and burned in clinical trials and was recently declared dead by its maker, at least dead for Alzheimer's disease. But what I learned through this tip is I got a connection to this young, I think, fascinating and brilliant professor at Vanderbilt University, a guy by the name of Matthew Schrag. And I, of course, had no idea at the time that this was going to open up a world to me that I had never even imagined might exist associated with this disease. But Schrag was a guy who had looked carefully at the basic science. That's the scientific lab experiments that lead up to drug development involving this drug, Simufilum. And he had found that many of them were apparently based on fraudulent work. And when I say fraudulent, that's the word used by some critics of the company. But basically what Schrag found were examples of scientific images that looked like they had been doctored, like someone went into Photoshop and moved some stuff around, erased some stuff. And this, of course, is misconduct in science. You can't do that with scientific images, especially when it seems to suggest that you're using these artificial techniques to suggest that the experimental outcome was successful when maybe it wasn't. So that was the door that opened when I learned more about what he had been doing on that drug. That was the beginning.
Wow. So this was the paper in Nature, right? That was published in, was it 2016?
That actually, that was next. So this issue with this drug, Simufilum, that was a different and I think really egregious case of apparent scientific misconduct involving this company and some of its scientists and affiliates. And what happened was that when I started to dive deeply into this with Schrag and to look at his work, and of course, as an investigative reporter, what I have to do is I have to assess the credibility of my sources. You can't just believe someone just because they have a claim. And so I had his work vetted very carefully by expert forensic image analysts and also by some of the leading subject matter experts in the science behind it, because what I wanted was both the kind of ground truth on whether his concerns might be true and also whether they mattered in the field. And so soon after I started talking to him, he clued me into another area that he was looking at in Alzheimer's research, and it had to do with what you're raising, this very important Alzheimer's study. This was published in 2006 in the journal Nature. Of course, many listeners may know that Nature is one of the preeminent scientific journals. Getting a paper in there, very important to your career, very influential in the field. And just to give you the context, why was it important that he found a paper in Nature that was apparently based on doctored images? Well, it was important for a couple reasons. So just to take you back, if you'll forgive me, I'm going to go back more than 100 years for just a minute. So the discoverer of Alzheimer's disease is this guy by the name of Alois Alzheimer, a German, who back in 1906 defined this disease as consisting of these so-called amyloid plaques. These are sticky plaques that accumulate in a person's brain. The other kind of tangled protein that's been named tau that is within nerve cells in the brain, and symptoms of dementia. Pretty simple, kind of three legs of the stool. And if you look at the history of research, not that much was done on Alzheimer's research for many decades. And the reason is that it's purely a demographic issue, because not that many people were growing so old as to be in the most susceptible age group for dementia, and particularly Alzheimer's dementia. And so what happened is that there was a demographic change. People lived longer because of dramatic scientific developments, medical developments, better, more healthy lifestyles in many cases. And as a result, the rate and the number of Alzheimer's patients dramatically increased as we got into the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. So an enormous amount of interest suddenly was pumped into the field of studying the disease. So the idea that gained enormous credence at that time, and I know, Max, you're familiar with this. I've heard your, I think, quite erudite discussions of these on some other podcasts about the so-called amyloid hypothesis of Alzheimer's. And that, just to refresh listeners' memories, is the idea that this amyloid protein, the one that causes the sticky plaques, is the beginning of a cascade of biomedical effects in the brain that leads to dementia. And this idea was so popular and so important, in part because it made a lot of sense. Because people who died and had Alzheimer's dementia, and then autopsies were done of their bodies and their brains, a lot of them nearly all had amyloid protein in their brain. And so it became an idea that we have to find a way to clear out this amyloid protein. Honestly, it's so logical that it became something that almost became a kind of item of faith in the field.
It's such an easy story to buy into.
Yeah, you get rid of this one bad thing and presto, people are cured. So a lot of study went into it, and eventually drug development. And by the early 2000s, there were clinical trials going on that were pretty successful at removing these amyloid proteins from the brain, but unfortunately not at all successful at improving cognition. And also, some of them caused very serious side effects. And consequently, there was a bit of discouragement that had entered, and people began to ask in the scientific community, well, are we really traveling down the right path? Is it appropriate for us to just all be so deeply committed to the amyloid hypothesis that had already begun to just, like a gigantic star, just gravitational pull for money and mind share and scientific interest and published papers was just enormous. And then something very important happened. Now I'm about to tie it back to Matthew Schrag and his big discovery. In 2006, there was a very important paper published in Nature magazine. And again, this is that important scientific journal. This paper by primarily the two most important authors were Sylvain Lesnay and Karen Ash at the University of Minnesota. Ash, illustrious Alzheimer's scientist, had made many important contributions to the field. Lesney, her protege, considered to be a wizard in the lab and someone who was a rising star. The two of them came out with an experiment that took mice that had been genetically engineered to produce copious amounts of amyloid protein in their brains. And then they would extract it and purify one certain protein that they named amyloid beta star 56, their star protein, A beta star 56. And this protein, they found that if they injected it into rats, almost immediately caused memory problems that were described as being akin to Alzheimer's memory problems. So what you had was, for the first time ever, an example of a specific substance that seemed to demonstrably cause, we'll call it Alzheimer's in animals. And it took the field by storm. It became one of the most cited experiments in Alzheimer's over a period of decades that followed. And this study studied this particular kind of amyloid protein called oligomer proteins. Now, these are different from the sticky plaques. They are proteins that are soluble in the fluid that bathes your brain, and consequently, they're just a different form of the same protein. And so what happened was the National Institutes of Health, which is the biggest funder for scientific research in the country, this kind of scientific research, and corporations that were doing drug development, they all poured their money into this so-called oligomer form of amyloid proteins. Hundreds, thousands of experiments, literally billions of dollars were pouring into it over a period of years. And yet, even though many drugs were developed, experimental drugs, to treat Alzheimer's based on the idea, the singular idea, that you are extracting these terrible proteins from the brain and you should see a cognitive improvement or some really obvious cognitive benefit from these. But what they were finding was no cognitive benefit. Even when they very thoroughly removed these proteins from the brain, they weren't getting the help that was really so desperately needed by patients and their families. So this goes on for a while, and there's a lot of discouragement in the field again. But there had been this kind of tremendous force and momentum behind the study of these oligomer type of amyloids, the soluble type.
Galvanized by that 2006 paper and subsequently billions of dollars, enthusiasm that was probably at that point waning, and what they showed in that paper, or at least what they attempted to show, what they fraudulently showed, was that A beta star 56 was the missing link connecting this amyloid plaque to the clinical features of Alzheimer's disease.
Exactly right. And it was such a profound result in the experiment that people just thought we're really on the right track. So what happened was that by early 2022, I was working closely with Matthew Schrag. He was feeding me enormous amounts of information about his findings, not just for this one study in Nature, but a whole panoply of work by those scientists having to do with this star protein, star 56 protein. And what we found was that in study after study, paper after paper, it was based on apparently doctored images, one after the other. And so consequently, as I mentioned, I did my normal reporting due diligence. I verified that the concerns seemed to be valid based on a secondary analysis by experts in forensic image detection. And then I showed it to scientists who were luminaries in the field to try to get their perspective on whether it was a meaningful, important finding, even though it might have been true, but how significant was it in influencing the field? And what I found was we had that sort of strangely kind of a coherence of the two aspects of it, true and influential, and based on doctored images. So what you had was suddenly a kind of crisis in the field. When my story came out, I know you saw it, many people in the field saw it. It was also in the popular press, really globally. It was global headlines. And the reason for it, The reason it was so interesting to people is that it asked a basic question. Has the importance and power of the amyloid hypothesis been challenged in a really significant way by this seminal experiment being shown to be based on doctored evidence?
So the question that naturally arises is, how did this paper, if the peer review process is functioning as it should, particularly for a journal such as Nature, which is so highly esteemed, how did it pass through that process, the peer review process? And then I guess the follow-up question would be, if it had been published for 16 years, and one of the core tenets of science is reproducibility, right, for science to advance, how come nobody else identified this until 16 years later?
Yeah, those are terrific questions that, believe me, I've sweated those questions mightily because, to me, that's at the core of why we're concerned about this. So let me address first the peer review thing. So listeners may know that in scholarly journals, the papers are usually reviewed by experts in the field who generally ask questions. They might point out weaknesses. They might require rewrites of the paper. That's a way of establishing the scientific quality and reliability. But one problem is that peer reviewers are not trained or expected to examine images for possible doctoring. And so they don't. Just to give you a slight anecdote, digression, in another story that I worked on also in this realm, I talked to a guy who was an expert in the science that I was looking at and showed him a bunch of papers that had apparently doctored images to get his opinion about it. And he looked at the analysis of the images, and he said to me he was stunned because it was a paper that he had personally peer reviewed, and he had no idea. It's because they don't get trained to do that. They're not expected to do it. So that, to me, first of all, is a terrible flaw in the peer review process, number one. But also, I should add that who's responsible for that? Well, the journals need to be doing their own quality control. They need to be using AI programs to examine these images. They need to have people on staff who are sufficiently expert to see stuff and to ask questions if it doesn't look quite right. And I'm happy to say that many journals are starting to do that, but it's taken way too long.
And yeah, and then the fact that this was just out there, I mean, science moves so slow, I mean, probably for good reason, but the fact that it was, had subsequently been cited by thousands of papers, that it was only 16 years later, and then 2 years after that it was finally retracted.
That's right. It was finally retracted 2 years later. And I might add that here's one of the strangest things from that particular story, which was the genesis of my book, Doctored.
A must read, by the way, and written for a lay audience. Is that correct?
Absolutely. It's a narrative. It's a character-based narrative. I try to tell the story of the important questions about the way Alzheimer's research has gone through the eyes of the people who live that story, including patients and including Matthew Schrag, who I mentioned before, and other doctors and other scientific sleuths, as they're called. So this small anecdote, if you'll permit me another little digression, is when the article came out in 2022, my article about this 2006 Nature paper that was based on fraudulent images, apparently fraudulent images, I should say. What happened is there was a big outcry in the scientific community, and there's a website that's a kind of a watering hole, you might say, online for Alzheimer's experts. It's called Alz Forum, and within about 2 days of my article coming out, they had more than 30 of the top experts in the world weighing in on what it all meant. And basically, you had two kinds of paths that they took. One group was saying, it's about time that we took a good hard look at ourselves in the mirror and asked the question, are we relying too heavily on the amyloid hypothesis? Do we need to broaden our horizons? And the other side were people who were saying that, no, we always knew this was BS, that this experiment didn't mean anything and it doesn't affect anything. And strangely, those very people are the people who quoted this study over and over and over in their own papers to support their own ideas about the disease.
Wow.
That is what I call, at best, hypocrisy.
Absolutely. So to me, I mean, this is blatantly criminal. What is the latest? Because I've been asked this, and I don't know. What is the latest with Karen Ash and Sylvain Lesny, the two authors behind that 2006 paper?
Sure. There are consequences for this sort of circumstance. I should say that the consequences are, look, it's when you say criminal, I don't know, it's a legal thing, and I don't know how you'd even interpret it in this case, but there were investigations done. And it turned out, and I feel convinced that this is true, that Karen Ash did not personally manipulate images. She did not try to falsify any data, but she did rely on her close colleague, Sylvain Lesny, and he doesn't seem to have any explanation for what happened. He's the one who prepared these scientific images, but he can't quite explain what had happened. Now, what happened is that even so, because I think you could charitably call the circumstance with Karen Ash very unfortunate, but also a big lapse in her judgment in not sufficiently supervising her protege in her own lab. And consequently, her reputation has been harmed, clearly, and she has lost a lot of her funding. Those are pretty serious things for a senior scientist. For Lesny, he's been investigated by the University of Minnesota, and so far as I know, that investigation, more than coming up on 3 years later, is still ongoing. And it reflects another weakness in the system of checks and balances in this issue of how fraudulent or perhaps just suspect research is produced and examined, and that's the university. So the entities that normally do these examinations or investigations of alleged misconduct are the home institution of the professor who's involved. And what we've seen over and over again is this is a tremendous conflict of interest because these are the institutions that have the most to lose and the least to gain from doing a robust, prompt, and publicly accessible examination of important studies.
Yeah. Now, you reveal so much in your book. In the aftermath of this expose that you published in Science magazine, I mean, what would you say is the current state of the amyloid hypothesis, and what are there any prominent emerging hypotheses that exist to supplant it?
Sure. The current state of things, I've done a lot of additional work, and a lot of what Doctor's about is looking more closely at the development of the amyloid hypothesis, how it has become the preeminent way of looking at the disease even now, and what the evidence is for possible misconduct or falsification of other studies in the field. And so a lot of what my book does is it looks very much more broadly at this question of falsification and doctoring of data, and unfortunately found that there's an enormous amount of it going on in the field. Now, let me make it clear that I work for Science magazine, which is also one of the preeminent scientific journals, and I believe deeply in science. I believe deeply in the integrity of most researchers, and I feel like their work has been so important for the human race and for medical development for many, many years. So I'm saying this you might say, from a position of love. They need to clean up their act. There's just too many problems and weaknesses in the system that gives openings for people who really do want to kind of like criticize or tear down important scientific institutions without a thoughtful process of what the pros and cons are and what the important things are to preserve in that. So let me just say, having said that, yes, there's enormous harm being done by falsified research. I found basically several hundred other important Alzheimer's studies that were apparently based on doctored images. And a lot of these have had a profound effect on the field. One example is the guy who was until recently the head of the neuroscience division of the National Institute on Aging. And this is a agency within the federal government that is the primary funder of Alzheimer's research. And this guy, by the name of Eliezer Maslia, I found, working again with a team of incredibly brilliant image sleuths and experts in neuroscience, that more than 130 of his studies, going back decades, had been based on apparently doctored or improperly changed images. And this is the guy who was at the pinnacle of how we decide on what to fund in the field and who gets the money. And
using taxpayer dollars, no less.
Billions of taxpayer dollars. And so what happened is that when my story came out in Science magazine last fall, on the day it came out, he was forced out of his job. Now that's a good outcome. It's a good outcome in the sense that we can't have someone who's under that sort of a cloud, whose work is suspect. And I say suspect because in any of these cases, even if the evidence seems almost incontrovertible that doctoring of images took place, it should be examined carefully by well-qualified experts to validate those concerns if they can be validated. In this case, the evidence was so substantial that it seems almost unimaginable that there weren't really dramatically big problems with his work. But if he can be a guy who's doing that, you got to ask yourself the question, how deep does this go? How broad does it go? It goes pretty broad and deep, and it's a big problem, something that needs to be cleaned up. The community of scientists, the institutions, including universities and federal funders and regulators, they need to do a better job. And that's really what this book is about, is encouraging them to do it. Now, I know, Max, you had a question about alternatives. What are people thinking? Alternatives to the hypothesis? Wasn't that?
Yeah, alternatives to the amyloid hypothesis. I mean, I'm certainly aware of some, but what are the rising stars in the ashes of, or maybe there are still some that do believe that the amyloid hypothesis is the correct way to go, but what would you say are the most viable alternatives at this point?
Sure. And let me just say that as far as the amyloid hypothesis goes, I think even the most skeptical of scientists about that way of looking at things agree that amyloid proteins have some role to play in the disease. It's not like people are saying, oh, these have absolutely nothing to do with Alzheimer's, even though there's a lot of evidence to suggest that the overall hypothesis is suspect. But fortunately, there's been a lot of creative thinking going on, even though Alzheimer's has been dominated by the amyloid hypothesis for many years. No single idea can completely crowd out the vastness of creativity in the scientific world. And consequently, there have been a lot of interesting things happening. One that I think is promising, and we'll know fairly soon whether there's significant data associated with it, is the idea that latent infections might be a cause or a principal kind of a way of affecting Alzheimer's disease. One set of experiments involves the herpes virus. And this, of course, is the virus that can cause cold sores, other lesions on the body. And usually they go away and people don't really think about it after that very much, except that the virus can hang around in some organs of the body, including the brain. And there are people who think by experimenting on trying to attack that angle that they might have good success. And there's laboratory work to suggest that it's at least worth pursuing aggressively, which I'm happy to say is now being done. Another realm that I think is pretty interesting and shows a kind of new kind of creativity and hope is the GLP-1 inhibitors. So these, of course, are the drugs that are for the weight loss drugs, Lugavere and the lookalike drugs that have been so important in providing a remedy for both diabetes and just for obesity, that have been, whatever their pros and cons, and they're pretty new. Clearly, some people have been having a lot of success with them. It's thought by some experimenters that these might also have a beneficial effect on cognition from Alzheimer's disease by reducing inflammation in the brain, which is another area that people have thought for a long time is likely to play a role in Alzheimer's. And so there are clinical trials going on. I think by the end of maybe either sometime in 2026, we're going to see results from these trials with the GLP-1 inhibitors, and we'll know whether there's some kind of hopeful trend there that could eventually be used to help treat the disease and either slow or stop cognitive decline, and maybe someday something that would actually reverse some of the effects of the disease.
Yeah, I mean, the GLP-1 trials are very exciting to me, and not because I'm a fan of the idea of using GLP-1 drugs as a preventative strategy or treatment strategy for Alzheimer's disease, but instead, rather for the diet and lifestyle implications that by not becoming a type 2 diabetic, by not being obese, and of course these are well-established modifiable risk factors, of course, for Alzheimer's disease. I mean, we have this sort of epidemiology that we might be able to borrow some of those insights and apply them to our own lives without necessarily having to use drugs.
Sure, I agree, Max. And one of the things that I know that you've talked about this many times, and it's really wise advice, which is Alzheimer's is a terrifying disease, but you don't have to be in a situation where you have no control over your circumstances. And maintaining a healthful lifestyle, eating well, eating healthful foods, controlling your blood pressure, thinking about cholesterol, obviously trying to do what you can to avoid becoming diabetic, and by, again, particularly with diet and exercise. Those are things that, as you say, are known risk factors associated with Alzheimer's. People can forestall the worst progression of the disease by doing that. I don't know if scientists really understand completely the degree to which you can prevent Alzheimer's with a healthful lifestyle. But one thing I know for sure is you can benefit yourself in a multitude of ways, not even just with Alzheimer's, but you can live a better, happier life by doing that stuff.
Amen. Now, I know your dad had Lewy body dementia, which is what my mom had. And so I don't know the degree to which that has inspired your work, but I mean, how did you feel when you were making all of these discoveries and going down this rabbit hole just to see how fraught with fraud, the very field representing the condition that both of our loved ones suffered from, how pervasive it was?
Yeah, it of course it's been sobering and really just kind of a terrible set of revelations for me personally, in part because of, well, my mom actually had been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and my dad had Parkinson's and Lewy body dementia. So, this strikes close to my heart. It's interesting with my dad. Late in his life, he became kind of almost childlike, and it was very sad because this was a vital, thoughtful, and a person who lived life in full ways until he was stricken by the disease at a pretty young age. And but it made me realize that I owe it to my family, to myself, and to everyone out there who is a caregiver for patients who are suffering from these diseases, to tell it to them straight and to give them the opportunity to learn more in order to set their expectations and demand better from the scientific institutions that are at the heart of trying to cure or at least treat these diseases.
Amen. So your mom had Alzheimer's, your dad had Lewy body dementia. Have you looked into your own genetics? Have you taken steps, adopted strategies as a preventative measures, knowing that you have risk factors on both sides?
No, I've chosen not to. And my dad was quite young when he was first diagnosed with Parkinson's, 62. So I am older than 62. And so I'm feeling pretty confident that I don't have early onset Parkinson's, which is a relief. But I am practicing what I preach. I am maintaining a healthful lifestyle and exercising regularly and trying to exercise my mind and body in ways that would give me a bit of confidence going forward.
Amen. Wow. Are you at all familiar with the work of Ray Dorsey? He's a neurologist at University of Rochester.
No, he's not someone I've run across yet.
I'd love to connect you with him. He's a scientist and neurologist, and he's done a lot of work advocating for more awareness around environmental exposures and their causal connection to Parkinsonian conditions, Lewy body dementia, Parkinson's disease, which is now the world's fastest growing brain disease. So yeah, I'd love to connect you with him. I feel like there would be a lot of synergy in your work.
That sounds exciting. I wanted to mention one other thing, Max, if we have a few more minutes.
Of course.
One of the things that's happened recently is that there have been, and I'm sure some people listening will know all about this, that there have been some drugs that have come to market that are based on the amyloid hypothesis. These are antibody drugs, so they produced in a lab, but they mimic the behavior of your immune system by attacking amyloid proteins in your brain and trying to drag those out of your brain. And they're very successful at doing that, like some of the earlier anti-amyloid drugs that were failures in the market. These have been approved by the Food and Drug Administration. So there have been a couple that are now on the market. And these drugs, their names are Leqembi and Kinsula. And these two drugs they're quite expensive. They cost tens of thousands of dollars, although they are covered by Medicare. And even with Medicare, they're very expensive, priced out of the market for a lot of people who maybe are on fixed incomes, as many elderly people are. But what I wanted to say about it is that the science behind these suggests that they slow the progression of Alzheimer's dementia in a statistically significant way. And what I mean is that they did a study with many people in it. They measured the results of the group that took the drug and the group that took a placebo, which is the kind of classic sugar pill, although in this case it's infused into a vein, so it's just a infusion that doesn't have any drug in it. And then they tested people's cognitive changes over time. And when I say a statistically measurable change, it's something you can show statistically, but it's very, very tiny. To a very minute degree, their cognitive decline slowed compared to people on the placebo. So what does this mean? Well, unfortunately, what it means is that for many patients, families, and doctors, people who have examined this closely and have treated patients have said that the difference may be statistically meaningful, but it might not be clinically meaningful. In other words, the patients and their families wouldn't even be able to perceive that it was giving you a benefit. Let me say that I don't object to anyone who feels that they want to try that anyway to do it, because, look, I'm not going to suggest that people should avoid something that they want to give a try, especially if they feel they're in a desperate situation, as many Alzheimer's patients do. But they should be advised that there are sometimes very bad side effects of these drugs, brain swelling and bleeding, that in cases causes death. And as a result, since some people have died from taking these drugs, from brain swelling or bleeding, the FDA has slapped what they call a black box warning on the product insert for this drug. And what that means is it's the strongest level of warning from the FDA. It means that it could cause death. And so what I'm saying is that it's your life. If you want to try this, or if your family feels that it would be beneficial for you to try this, not everybody who takes it dies, obviously. Most people do not. It's a risk-benefit equation that each individual has to ask themselves. But they should be advised that these drugs are not risk-free, and they're the best that the drug companies have to offer at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't take them. Why did they get approved based on? I mean, if I recall correctly, was it aducanumab or lecanemab? One of them was approved, given accelerated approval by the FDA, but it was, I mean, most of the experts on the committee were either like neutral or aghast that this was even like a proposition.
Yeah, it was a strange situation. I think one of the most controversial, and some have called it one of the most shameful actions on the part of the FDA in a long time. So basically what happened was that you had this drug, aducanumab, as you said, and the brand name was Aduhelm. And the committee, this is a committee of independent experts who the FDA asked, please evaluate all the science, all the research, and give us your considered opinion about whether this drug should be put on the market. Excuse me. So they did so. They looked at this carefully. And this committee of 11 people, 10 of them said, no way. The risks are way too high and the benefits are way too low. This should not be approved. One of them was kind of agnostic on the question. And so you had this gigantically lopsided vote against approval, and FDA approved the drug anyway. Some of the experts on the committee, which included eminent scientists, ethicists, and public health officials, resigned from the committee immediately in protest. So what happened was this drug was eventually pulled from the market because it was ineffective and dangerous. But a subsequent drug called lecanemab, as you mentioned, that was the generic name for it, and the brand name is Leqembi, was then evaluated. It had a minutely better statistical profile than its predecessor drug. And meanwhile, the FDA cleaned out the committee, got rid of the people who were critical of this approach, and put in people who were very supportive of the approach, including people who had commercial relationships, payment relationships with the companies developing the drug. And they approved the drug. They voted to approve the drug ultimately. The FDA itself, I might add, gave its preliminary approval before even seeing the final data on the clinical study that was central to evaluating the proposition. So I think it's pretty clear that the agency really wanted to approve this drug, one, because they're under enormous pressure from lobbyists from the drug companies who have sunk enormous costs into it. Two, the patient advocates and some of the big patient advocacy groups also were pushing them hard. I'm not casting aspersion on the genuine desire of those groups to help find good treatments and cures for these diseases like Alzheimer's, but it's also pretty clear that they're desperate to show their constituency that there's some progress being made, even in a case where that progress is, I think most scientists would call either minimal or dubious.
Are these organizations, these nonprofit patient advocacy groups, I mean, we don't have to name them, but are they financially invested in the success of these drugs?
Well, they are actually in two ways. They have themselves fundraised from individuals and from companies, including companies that are developing these drugs. And so they are financially dependent to a degree on these companies, although they would argue their funding sources are diverse, which they are. And so they also have themselves funded related research. So yes, they have an interest in seeing it be successful. I might add that there's another factor here that people might sometimes either forget about or not really realize, which is that the FDA itself, which is, again, an institution that I think has done enormous good in the world, is something that I personally think is the best such agency in the world in being able to help protect the food and drug supply from tainted products and from drugs that are basically just snake oil from making it through. But it's far from perfect. And what we see, one of the big problems is that there's this revolving door between the agency and the drug companies.
I just got goosebumps as you said that, because that's been so topical as of late. One of the things, I don't know where you stand on Robert F. Kennedy Jr., but one of the things that he's campaigned against has been the conflicts of interest in our regulatory agencies. And one of the figures that often comes up, or two, is that almost 50% of the FDA's budget comes from user fees that it derives from the pharmaceutical industry. And then two, that many of the high-level officers at the FDA historically will then go and take high-paying, cushy jobs within the pharmaceutical industry. So it's the conflicts of interest.
You're right. I think it's a gigantic problem, and I think Congress should fund the FDA instead of having it rely on so-called user fees from the drug companies to evaluate these drugs. It creates an inherent conflict and a really serious one. So yes, as far as Robert F. Kennedy Jr. goes, there's a lot of things I do not agree with in what he said. One thing that I do agree with is that it's important to look at these agencies as important jewels in our way of examining food and drugs, and to also take it seriously that we want them to do the best job they can do, and reform is really, really necessary. Removal of some of these conflicts of interest, better funding, and also sometimes better vigilance about kind of phony or suspect drugs getting through the process.
How can people listening to this, watching this, I mean, because right now you're reaching a huge audience of consumers, loved ones of patients. How can we advocate for better science?
That's a great question. Well, for me, what I'm trying to do with Doctored and generally as a reporter is to use the platforms that I have to expose wrongdoing in such a way that really questions these kinds of problems, but also tries to inspire hope in alternatives and tries to inspire people to remember that they have agency in their lives and they have the ability to pressure their elected representatives and doctors and ask questions that would be able to give them a big picture of how to address their own ailments, as I know that you have often encouraged people to do, but also to pressure the system to do better. We are lucky in this country to have some of the best universities, the best funders, biggest funders of important scientific research, some of the best regulators of scientific and drug development. And what we need to do is to insist that they do their jobs better and to eliminate some of the misconduct and difficulties that have led to the problems that I've been writing about. And we have the capacity to do that. We have the capacity to demand it.
There are, I'm sure, listeners of this episode of the show who have taken an interest specifically in Alzheimer's disease because they have loved ones that are suffering from dementia. I'm certainly the son of somebody who suffered from it, as are you. What would you say are the current best options in terms of more cutting edge treatments at this juncture?
Honestly, Max, that's not something I feel qualified to say with any clarity. But the one thing I can say is think about it early. Take care of yourself early. Think through what your family history is and try to understand what your risk might be. And then to take positive action to become as healthful as you can be, because not only is it its own reward, but it's also something that can be helpful in forestalling effects of these dementias should they arrive.
Are you at all familiar with the research on the ketogenic diet?
I've heard of it, but I haven't studied it carefully. I don't have a clear view of the importance of it. What have you learned about it?
Well, it's certainly not a panacea, but there, as a dietary intervention, the ketogenic diet has been a gold standard treatment for certain forms of epilepsy for a century at this point. Mm-hmm. And it's remarkable in the sense that, there are innumerable diets adopted by people around the globe, but none of them change the brain's chemistry as significantly as the ketogenic diet does, because it's essentially changing the primary fuel substrate of the brain. And in Alzheimer's disease, there's, as I'm sure you well know, there's the problem of glucose hypometabolism. So the brain struggles to basically generate energy from glucose, and its ability to generate energy from these ketone bodies, I believe, is unperturbed. And so there are some studies, human clinical trials, that show a small but significant improvement in certain variables, quality of life and whatnot. More so the earlier on in the disease course. So mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, there seems to be more of an improvement. But So, it's certainly not a cure, not a panacea or anything like that. But and then there's also there's an FDA approved medical food called Axona, which is basically like a medium chain triglyceride, which you consume and it becomes a ketone body. The liver converts these fats to ketone bodies, and it's FDA approved for Alzheimer's disease. So yeah, I was just curious if you had any.
Well, I knew I was going to learn some things that I needed to look more deeply into when I came here today. So thank you for those ideas. I'm going to definitely jump into that.
It's super interesting. Yeah, there's aside from the fueling aspect, of these ketone bodies, they also seem to have other pleiotropic effects. They seem to upregulate growth factors like BDNF, which I know is diminished in Alzheimer's disease. There are a few basic science studies showing that or suggesting that they might enhance clearance of these, soluble amyloid precursor proteins. And so, yeah, it just seems like a very interesting field of research, but it's likely understudied. I mean, that would be my guess, because it's essentially a dietary intervention. It can't be patented.
Yeah, I don't think there's any doubt that it's understudied. And I think one of the things that I'm hoping we'll see in the next coming years is that people will start to fund a much broader range of research into these ideas and explore maybe some of the things you're talking about and some of the things that are people in other labs are looking at as possible ways to attack the Alzheimer's puzzle. And I actually feel somewhat confident that that'll be the case.
I hope so. The yeah. Do you have any thoughts on the future of the field?
I do. I think we're at a moment, a kind of pivotal moment, where we're facing down the opportunity to greatly expand thinking about how to approach Alzheimer's and to, again, diversify research. I think that's already starting to happen, fortunately, notwithstanding the sort of dominance of the amyloid hypothesis. I think that there are many other ideas that are beginning to gain mind share in the scientific community and funding by the NIH as well, which is critical. I think one of the problems is that drug companies, they basically are mostly following the lead of scientists who get money from the NIH, and they're trying to use those findings to develop viable drugs for sales into the community. So I think we're looking at academic scientists who are our great hope for doing things that would be innovative and different and would exploit some of the biochemical processes like that you've been talking about and others that have kind of gotten short shrift.
Yeah, definitely. When I first began the production process for my documentary, Little Empty Boxes, I bumped heads and ran into a bit of conflict with somebody at one of these associations, on the surface, one of these very benevolent awareness, associations to raise awareness and funding for Alzheimer's disease. But they kind of attacked me because I was presenting, a different view of the condition, that it was potentially preventable and that diet and lifestyle mattered. I mean, that was like essentially the core thesis of my film at the time. And one of the journalists who I guess was on staff at this organization went so far as to write like a Wall Street Journal op-ed, basically diminishing my project. And I think the headline was something like "Misplaced Hopes for a Cure for Alzheimer's Disease." And the subheading was, people think that it was written in a very disparaging way, like coconut oil is not the cure for Alzheimer's disease, or, people are looking for hope in terms of THC and whatever, and which I've never talked about, and nor, has coconut oil ever been something that I've ever really put any emphasis on. But it's just wild the degree of pushback that you'll get for an idea when at the end of the day, this is a condition where there have been so many failures, and I think that its successes are going to come from out-of-the-box thinkers. And I'm just excited that 10 years later, because that was written about 10 years ago, and that's when I began the journey of producing this documentary, that we finally now have space for this. And I credit you, in many ways for helping to open up that space.
Well, thank you. I really appreciate that, Max. I mean, I think one of the issues that we face in this field is that there's an enormous amount of sunk cost into one way of looking at the puzzle. And there's also a multitude of scientists who have spent their entire careers trying to prove out the amyloid hypothesis. And when you've done that, when you've based your life's work on that, and when companies have spent billions of dollars and the government spent billions of dollars, it's very hard to broaden your horizons and to think differently about it. So the conventional wisdom is strong, but the diversity of human thought is stronger. And we have the opportunity to push back, to demand better, and at least to demand that evidence be stronger before we put all of our thought and all of our dedication and determination in one direction.
Yeah, but I guess that's why they say science advances one funeral at a time, is because these domineering personalities, they hold on to their domain for such a long time, and they're so aggressive and territorial, and I've personally seen that, and it's just it's unfortunate. Is Alzheimer's unique? Like, is the fraud that we've seen in the Alzheimer's field, is it unique relative to other fields? I mean, do you see the same degree of fraud?
Yeah, thanks for asking that, Max. I should have mentioned, I do not think it's unique. I think it's, again, I think the vast majority of scientists are honest. They're people of integrity who are deeply determined to be successful in their work. But there's enough going on in all the different scientific fields to raise questions about what the influence of that might be. Now, that said, what's different about Alzheimer's in this sense? It's a bit more tragic because unlike heart disease, diabetes, cancer, there have been a dearth of treatments and remedies for Alzheimer's. In all of those other diseases, there have been all kinds of stuff, healthy lifestyles, drugs, radiation, surgery that have helped people live stronger, better lives, and even in some cases cures. Not so with Alzheimer's. It's been something that has been such a tough problem to solve, and therefore, when there is doctoring of scientific images, falsification of research, or doubts about the veracity of important researchers, it's much more tragic.
Yeah, well, I think people should definitely support your work, pick up your book. I mean, fascinating and depressing, but also you offer hope. And I think, yeah, sunlight is the best disinfectant. And you've brought a lot of light to this field, sorely needed light. So thank you, Charles.
Thank you so much, Max. I appreciate your questions, and thanks for having me on.
Of course. I've got one last question for you. Before we get to that, where can listeners pick up Doctored?
Doctored can be picked up basically everywhere. If your local bookstore doesn't have it, please order it from them, or you can get it from any of the online retailers.
And are you on social media or?
I am. I'm on X at @cpillar. And I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm also, and of course, LinkedIn. And I have a brand new website, which is charlespillar.com. So
congrats, that's cool.
Find out a lot about me there.
You're the first person on our show to drop a Blue Sky handle.
Okay.
Which is funny. Well, again, I really appreciate your work. The last question that gets asked to everybody on the show: what does living a genius life mean to you?
For me, the struggle is sometimes work-life balance. And I'll tell you, the most genius thing that's happened to me in recent years is the birth of my granddaughter. And so my wife and I spend a lot of time not just taking care of her, but being with her and developing that strong bond and relationship with a little child that is unique and is so satisfying, and also really just completely pushes me out of my normal comfort zone, which is also important.
I love it. Well, mazel tov. That's amazing. Very exciting. And yeah, This was illuminating. Thanks for coming in.
Okay, thank you so much.
Hey, if you liked that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.